Welcome both. Thank you so much. I wanted us to have a brief conversation by way of introducing our audiences a little bit further into the program. So I wanted to start by asking you to describe what was going through your minds when Serpentine, an art institution, invited you to curate this program as part of our Back to Earth project, and where are you now, almost 2.5 years later?
Wow, here we are. First of all, I really want to thank Kostas for being so patient and persistent, very persistent sometimes. When we first started talking about this event, you have to understand this was quite a while before the pandemic, and it seemed like it was a topical thing to discuss, but we imagined that we were going to have a gathering in London, and we would all go our separate ways. Instead, we've now had a partnership of 3 years, and there have been shifts and changes in what we imagined the program would look like, what kind of focus we might have, and even how the program would be conducted. And I think we had at least 2 other dates that we were going to go forward with and then canceled. So it's sort of remarkable that we're here. It's scary too. I mean, when I came in, I was like, I feel like I should have a mask on. I feel like everyone else should have a mask on. And so there's something about the assembly that we are that is both a triumph and a space of jeopardy. And I think we're going to have to experience both of those things over the next few days together.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to be here this afternoon. Muy buenas tardes. I agree with Jack that this was a very different moment a couple of years ago. I think it was 4 dates that shifted in time. We have gotten to know Kostas well. Thank you, Kostas, for everything you've done. I think you've been in Greece, you've been in Europe, you've been in different places. Every time we Zoomed, it was a different site. So of course, that's about the times, fleeing, changing, the mutations that we're all going through in this moment. I think for me, part of the work was to extend what we were already doing in the Global South Center, to bring activists, artists, intellectuals together to think about platforms, to think about the university differently, to think about cultural institutions in a time of crisis, and what it means to actually convert cultural institutions, perhaps dismantling, but also remaking those, and those third spaces, as Soja used to say, into something that can feed the political projects and ecologies, social ecologies of our moment. So that's very tied, I think, to the work today. For me, it's also about thinking beyond colonialism, beyond the colonial gender and sex structures that have been inherited, to think beyond kind of the dominant racial orders. And so that's part of the programming that I think we both envision, and with Kostas, of how to imagine anew with you all as well. And one thing I was thinking about, what we may or may not have programmed in, is around the dialogic or dialogue. And so I hope you'll see today as the beginning of a set of conversations, provocations, opportunities to think together, and that, we didn't want to do a kind of breakout session just to enjoy this beautiful space and its history, and that will continue. There'll be more of this kind of programming, especially with some of the performances you'll see today and beyond. So, yes.
Thank you. And Macarena, today we are focusing on your research and your work on the Global South, on indigeneity, the negative impact of extractive capitalism, and queer and trans embodiment, among other topics. And you are also the one that introduced me to the work of Seba Kalfouker, who's performing shortly. And there's a wonderful piece that you wrote and in conversation with Seba that is online at the Serpentine website that I urge you all to go and look for. Can you tell about what you were thinking in terms of Saturday when we were putting it together?
Yes, and I forgot when I just spoke recently in opening to thank both of you. It's been just such a gift to be able to do this work. I think with you, Kostas, you have such a gentle intelligence, your brilliant capacity of community making, and Jack's intellectual wildness that I've learned so much from, and a kind of almost more than human generativity, as you heard, the proliferation of so many ideas. So I think part of the work for me is is in conversation with you all to create these worlds, to think about writing, making, doing performance in the context of finding a way to build again and new models. So I invited Global South artists and thinkers and activists today. And I think, alongside the programming that Jack has done and Kostas has done, that these are some of the most exciting and innovative thinkers and makers of our time. I don't say that lightly. I think they're queering and thinking through new ways of presenting environmental art, rethinking what that category, exploding the category of environmental thinking. I think we need to hear from these perspectives. We need to see this work. We need to perceive with these artists anew. And for me, the most obvious modality that I share with these artists is really a desire for exploration, for experimentation, which I would say is a queer desire. So I look forward to that. And I'll just say briefly that you'll be introduced to Seba Calfuqueo's amazing work. It's a performance and multimedia art practice. I think they explode the category of native art, which is often seen as very conventional or traditional or very static. I think they break open a kind of colonial history of art practice, and they do that through grounded practice, through a kind of liquid aesthetic, and through an anti-extractive, non-binary approach to their artwork. You know, you can read more about how the specificities of gender and sex, because in Mapuche, in Mapuzungun, in Wallmapu, the original territories of Seba Calfuqueo's practice, there is a proliferation of gender terms for non-binary, and we tried to catalog those in the piece that you commissioned. So you'll also not see very much, but you'll hear from Maori artist Victoria Hunt and their performance art. And I hope that we get the chance to program together more in the future, but she is an actress, animator, a writer, performer, and their themes are really grounded in an episteme of Maori practice, the Pafa, that I'll say more about later. Then you'll also hear from Juan Francisco Salazar, who's a visual anthropologist who does really exciting work, was one of the recent curators of the Sydney Art Biennial on water. I think they make this gorgeous work on speculative documentary practices and in queer geographies, like Antarctica. So I do think this is an exceptional day of work, and you might not have heard of some of these artists, and that's part of the work from of kind of lifting, translating, mediating El Sur Global, the global south, the different spaces that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maca. And Jack, tomorrow we are focusing on your work on wildness. A place where, as you say, the environment speaks back, where communications bow to intensity, where worlds collide, cultures clash, and things fall apart. You'll be also speaking on unworlding. As Hendrik mentioned, your current work that you are doing for a second volume on wildness that focuses on the aesthetics of collapse. And can you also tell us what we can expect from tomorrow's program and where your thinking was when you were putting it together with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that we're in this space that was a queer club. I'm probably one of the few people who is of an age that came here when it was a queer club. But it really forces us to think about the way in which queer bodies have congregated and the kinds of sounds that we have made together, some of which will be reflected in the work of Ash Fure tomorrow. And thinking about how we occupy space, how queer time and space resonate through interests in queer ecologies. Some of those questions will be directed, as with the curation that Macarena has done, through work that resonates outside of a Euro-American context and is in conversation with the Global South. And some of the focus will also be on architectures. And again, that's an incredibly important thing to think about as we occupy this particular space, as we think about what it means to be next to each other, to be adjacent, to be in proximity, to think about intimacy in a moment of intense waves of infection, not only between humans, but also between humans and animals. not to mention monkeypox, but there are so many of these waves of infection now that, like HIV/AIDS, spread in particular through intimate contact, which means that queer communities have to think differently about the way in which we are in space together, the kinds of contact that we have, and then the meaning of sexuality within a global frame, and in a moment of intense transfer of bodies back and forth across the globe. One thing that I want to say in general is that we maybe should try to think together about what it is that makes us so resistant to change. I mean, at meetings like this, we talk a lot about change, but change is a very, very difficult thing to bring about. So here we are, 2.5 years later, no longer talking about an impending crisis, but smack in the middle of that crisis that was then to come and is now here. This is a moment when we're going to have to confront what change would look like, how change is effective, what kinds of politics, vocabularies, and behaviors can be associated with that change, and how some of that thinking has already gone on under the heading of queer, trans, and feminist theory. And that's the kind of logic of tomorrow. The brilliant artists who I was able to bring to our gathering, Ashfur and Zabi Aguirre, are going to work with us on sound and architecture. And then we're also going to see videos from a local artist, Adam, and be together in hopefully inventive, creative, queer ways that will project different kinds of futures. And that's all to come.
That's amazing. And just very broadly speaking, I know that Macarena, you love fluidity and liquidity, and Jack, you love collapse at the moment. I like that these things are clashing. So I was wondering if you could tell us where you clash, where you diverge, where one takes something and goes on a different tangent and develops it in a different way, maybe with a particular focus in the Americas, for example, with you, Macarena, and vice versa with your work, Jack. Can you tell us about how you collaborate on ideas and projects?
Yeah, well, I mean, Maka's, as you could hear in that fantastic summary of what we're going to see today. I mean, Maka is absolutely rigorous about expanding the frameworks beyond the Euro-American, which are frameworks that I have sort of taken for granted in my work and been too comfortably situated within. And when we do turn to the global south, we realize that we're in relationship to completely different cosmologies and epistemologies. There are different ways of thinking about bodies and the environment. And so I've just learned so much from Maka's thinking, as well as from the archive that she assembles, these very creative, important archives that are, for her, a cause for a certain kind of critical optimism. And I think because I am more focused on a Euro-American frame, you'll hear that my orientation is much more towards collapse, dismantling, ending, destroying, creative destruction, and so on, which of course was the theme of the extinction event that we met around in the first place. But of course we need different strategies. The strategies that would be associated with the global south are not at all appropriate for the global north. So there's a nice sort of annexing of Maka's archive to my archive, and it is appropriate that I talk about endings and dismantlings in a kind of decolonial vein here, while Maka is opening up to these other, these in many ways creatively vast and teeming environments of art and ecology.
Yeah, I would say that we have a beautiful partnership and a challenging intellectual relationship in the sense that things are not always convergent. And there's often a culture clash at play, and we work it out. And we work it out over dinner, we work it out over, in conversation with you. I hope we haven't triangulated you too much in that. But it's certainly about, definitely, as you said, figuring out through different archives. But I also have seen an arc over the time that we have collaborated over 15, 16 years now, where perhaps I started more as a social scientist, a sociologist, maybe committed a little more, had a little bit more fidelity to a particular set of methods, and Jack was more of a kind of cultural studies, interdisciplinary, unruly thinker. And somehow we've been traveling paths, that now you're in an English department, and your latest book has a kind of undoing of the English canon, and my work has become very, very interdisciplinary and quite broad. And so I think we've learned from each other in that way. And I think part of it is that you are always challenging me to think in counterintuitive ways. And so I think I have something that's been submerged thinking, but then I hear Jack's take on it, and it's like, ooh, I have to push myself a little further. So I really appreciate that, and also in dialogue with you, Kostas, on these themes. So,
well,
yeah.
Thank you both. I look very much forward to speaking to you more and to what is coming this weekend. It's been an incredible journey so far, and here we are. Thank you all for being here, and we're going to do a very quick stage set change, and then we will introduce our first contribution for the day.
Okay.
Thank you.